Okie doke. Next video on, what's it on? Let me see. Substitution between alternative resource inputs. And I'm going to start, it was a bit rushed, the previous one. I had to go off to this meeting. So I'm going to start just by taking some key points from the previous one. So we set up this model and we said these WC and WD, which is basically about how tricky it is to get these inputs into the system. They are given, and XC and XD, which ends up as the quantities of the inputs coming in, they are endogenous variables, which are going to depend, among other things, on these prices. And R is the overall resource input, which comes out of here, and it's the CES combination of input C and input D, isn't it? Where epsilon is greater than 0, but less than 1. Okay, so what characteristics does this model have? If, for the time being, if we just say, well, let's say that WC and WD are constant, then, of course, the price of R will typically also be constant if at least if XC and XD stay the same relative to each other, if we're in a balanced situation, which we normally will be. If these are constant, why would you change these? So the price of R will also be constant. So looking at our data, we'll have Y, W, R. Here, what will R do? Well, if WR is constant from the Cobb-Douglas, we know, because the factor share of R is constant, that means if the price is constant, the quantity must track growth. Otherwise, the share won't be constant. Okay. What happens if D starts running out? It gets trickier. We have to dig deeper or something to get the D out. WD goes up. What happens? Okay, we've got good substitutability between D and C. Epsilon is bigger than 0. So when this input gets a bit more expensive, these guys are going to choose lots more of this and much less of this. So we'll actually, if WD goes up, we're going to spend less on D, not more. Yeah, it gets more expensive, we spend less on it because we shift to the other input to a very high degree. And that's what we see here, because this is positive. Okay, so now we're gonna, that's basically where we got to, but putting it into a bit of a context. Now we're gonna look at some data. So let me see here. What have we got? Well, I'm gonna have to maximize this. So what have we got? We've got coal and oil, haven't we? And in the left-hand figure, we've got prices. And if you look at the start, at the very start in like 1870, the oil price is similar to the coal price. And then it goes down from like 1870 through to 1970. The oil price is declining relative to the coal price, isn't it? And after that, the oil price goes up relative to the coal price. So how does that play out then in so that's just the prices. What more do we see? So we need to look at the other curves. I think I'm going to go back out of view, actually. We'll go back to this. So we need to look at the other curves. So what are the other curves here? In the same figure, the left-hand figure, we've got oil expenditure and coal expenditure. So when the oil price falls gradually between 1870 and 1970, oil expenditure compared to coal expenditure goes up. So we're shifting, as oil gets cheaper, we shift massively into oil and we spend more on oil. Epsilon is bigger than 0. Then when the oil price rockets, of course, then this short run inflexibility kicks in. There's no short run in this model at all, okay? So the model can't cope with that at all. But then if we look at the slightly longer run, the increase in the share of oil compared to coal stops, doesn't it, after about 1970. And also we see that the prices, certainly the fall in the oil price compared to the price of coal, has stopped. If we put a trend line from 1970 to 2010, or wherever this data gets to. Okay. What's the second figure showing? The second figure is showing the sum of expenditure on coal and oil in the parameterized model. Or in reality, that's the continuous line and in the parameterized model. So it's basically showing the model says there should be a fixed share, and the data shows that it's more or less a fixed share, apart from these big, the massive short run fluctuation around 1970, 1980. If anything, the share has increased somewhat, hasn't it? The third figure shows the relative shares of coal and oil in the data, the continuous line, and according to the model. And again, when we have violent short-run fluctuations in the prices, the model fails completely because it's not designed to deal with that. But the trend, the model does an amazingly good job of matching the trend, and that is with epsilon equals to 0.76. Okay. So basically, what we're getting out of that is that the model, oh, there's nothing really to show you. The model is doing a pretty good job of matching the data, assuming that epsilon, sorry, I'm in Swedish mode. Oh, epsilon is 0.76. Or the elasticity of substitution is 1 over 1 minus epsilon. It's around about 4, isn't it? So they're very good substitutes, oil and coal, according to this, in the long run, yeah, because this is the long run model. In the short run, there's very little substitutability, which is why you see these crazy differences. Okay, so the point is this model is doing a pretty good job of matching the data, and this seems to make a lot of sense. And that is ruling out changes, investment in like the productivity of the different inputs, changing like AC and AD. We said there's none of that going on. The second one, I think I'm going to zoom in again. So what have we got here? We've got iron and aluminium. And a bit like with coal, sorry, a bit like with oil, aluminium is taking the place of oil here. That early on, aluminium is very expensive because we don't really know how. For oil, we were just getting the hang of pumping up oil, like 1870 is when it all kicked off, basically. Here, in 1900, that's when we're first working out how to actually manufacture aluminium from bauxite, the aluminium ore. And so we see a fairly steep decline in the price of aluminium compared to the price of iron over the whole period, actually, but especially the first sort of 80 years, I would say. Yeah. And sure enough, as the price of aluminium falls, the factor share of aluminium rises, or the expenditure on aluminium relative to the expenditure on iron rises. We see that in the first figure. In the second figure, we see that the total expenditure on both is a very constant share of global GDP. It's about 0.2%. That's the alpha value you can see there. And again, we see that the model in the third figure does a fantastic job of capturing the relative shares. Again, there we're comparing the data to the model, and the model's doing an amazing job. Here, with an epsilon of 0.55, it says, doesn't it? So that would be eta of 1 over 1 minus 0.55, 1 over 0.45. That's like 2. Is it 2.2 or 2.4? 1 over 0.45, 0.9. I think it's 2.2, isn't it? So not as big an elasticity of substitution. Is that surprising? I don't know. You could certainly make an argument for that not being all that surprising. The coal and oil. So coal and oil are like great substitutes for some things, aren't they? Like making electricity. They're like fantastic substitutes for that. They're not such good substitutes for some other things like flying planes around. They're pretty good substitutes for driving trains. Not very good for flying planes. Well, terrible for that, and not great for cars either. Aluminium and iron, yeah, pretty substitutable for like making stuff with. Aluminium is lighter, so better for things like planes. Iron is cheaper, so better for things like bridges. And then there's a bunch of stuff in between where it's like, yeah, depending on the relative prices, we can go with aluminium here, we can go with iron here, evidently, because, or that's what the data is telling us, that they're pretty substitutable. Okay. So that's the model without technological change, yeah? There's the overall technological progress going on in the data. We saw it going up. And I guess I had that in the calibration as well. Oh, I haven't put it in there, but there must be some background growth going on in my calibration as well to match the background growth in GDP. I haven't given you the data on that. Where was I? Yeah, so there's background growth going on in that model, but there's no directed technological change. So what happens if we put in directed technological change? Solo's third mechanism, or the mechanism which says, look, if we start using this more than this, we should invest more in using it efficiently, and that will help the process along. Let's see how that plays out. So I think I'm going to pause the video, clean up, and then we'll do this modeling. Okay, so we're going to take this basic model, and actually I could have left the R equation as well. R is, but yeah, now we've got these ARs. Now we're going to say, And I can even drop the gammas. The A, I can sort of subsume the AR1 and AR2, or the A, what do I call it? C and D, AC. AC, and now I've called it C. I've changed notation. Sorry about that. ACC to the epsilon plus ADD to the epsilon, to the 1 over epsilon. So C and D are the physical inputs. These are the productivities. So before I kind of I took the A outside and I just said there's an A. Now I've left them inside and said they're going to change endogenously. Okay. In our old model, when we were looking at directed technological change between AL and AR with a CES here, we said, or we worked out in that model that ZL over ZR was equal to WLL over WRR, which was equal to ALL over ARR to the epsilon. In this model, we have instead, the math is basically the same, so I'm not going to go through it. We end up with ZC over ZD is equal to the relative shares, which is WCC over WDD, which is equal to ACC over ADD to the epsilon. The big difference is that epsilon is now positive, which means that if this goes up, this goes up, this goes up, this goes up, we tend to invest more. So if, for instance, hang on. Let me just check this. So let me see. Sorry, I just got to pause this. I'm comment on me. Okay, I'm not totally happy with my notes here, and I hadn't checked them carefully enough, I guess. But if this is our sort of final equation, we're treating C and D as exogenous, the quantities. We're treating them as exogenous. So then we say, and then the prices arise endogenously as a result of the quantities. So then we say, imagine C and D are exogenously given, and then imagine AC goes up. So we get more efficient in using C. Then this whole thing goes up because epsilon's positive, which means that this goes up. So when C gets more productive or cheaper effectively, we use a lot more of it, and the share of C goes up, and we invest even more in AC. Okay, so there's actually an inbuilt instability now in this system. If we want to treat prices as exogenous rather than quantities, then we need to do the trick that I did before with this. We want to get rid of this C and D. So we're going to multiply, forget this for now, and just look here. We're going to multiply both sides by C over D to the minus epsilon. We want to keep this like this, so we multiply both sides by WCC over WDD to the minus epsilon. And then we end up with 1 power of 1 minus epsilon here, and we end up with AC over WC, AD over WD for the epsilon. Then we take to the 1 over 1 minus epsilon, and we end up with that. So that's the relative shares in terms of technology levels and prices. So we can write that as well. This is what we use if the quantities are exogenously given. This is what we use if the prices are exogenously given. So what happens if C gets cheaper? WC goes down, this goes up, this goes up, the share of C goes up, we invest more in C. In C augmenting knowledge, AC goes up, this goes up even more, this goes up even more, we invest even more. Okay, where is that process going to stop? To answer that question, we need the knowledge production functions. And if we have knowledge production functions where the knowledge stocks grow independently of each other, then we might have, for instance, ACT over ACT minus 1 divided by ADT over ADT minus 1 equals ZCT. Actually, let's just do one at a time. So let's say ACT over ACT minus 1 is ZCT to the phi over zeta C. Okay. So this is saying the boost in C augmenting knowledge is a function of the investment raised to the power of phi. Okay, so this seems pretty innocuous, doesn't it? It doesn't seem very dangerous. And if we have a symmetric expression for dt, okay, then we can take the two expressions and divide one by the other. And what do we get? We get this, right? Which is what we've got in the notes. And where does this take us? If this is the case, then clearly we're not going to get a stable equilibrium. Okay. It turns out, and I don't think I'm going to take you through this because I don't think it really is that useful. But it turns out we can actually find a value. We can find a point where it's all balanced, where ACT over ACT minus 1 divided by ADT over ADT minus 1 equals 1. So if that is 1, it means that these two knowledge stocks are growing at equal rates. Okay, so the ratio is not changing. If the ratio of the prices is also constant, then it seems like we would have balance, wouldn't we? So if this is 1, if ZC over ZD is to the phi times that is 1, which means that ZC over ZD is zeta C over zeta D, so 1 over phi, I think. Yeah, they should end up the top lines because that's divided by. So for balance, we need this to hold, which means that for balance, we need the relative factor shares to be equal to that. Okay, that would give us balanced growth. But is it stable? Is that point stable, or is it balanced in this sense? Yeah. Is it balanced in this sense that we're going to head there and stay there, or is it just an unstable? In that sense, but an unstable point. And it's clearly unstable, isn't it? Because if you imagine, like I said, imagine we're at the balance point and then AC goes up. This whole thing goes up. The share of C goes up. ZC goes up. AC goes up even more. This goes up even more. ZC goes up even more. And there's nothing to stop this process. You're going to go, if this is C and this is D, you're going to go, woof. Yeah. So focus on the intuition. Imagine the economy is on a BGP and a small shock shifts it such that the share of C increases. What happens? Okay, wow. Well, we go through a bunch of math, but basically, I'm not going to take you through that. We are going to go off one way or the other. If AC goes up, we're going to end up in this corner. If AD went up, we would end up in this corner if we started off. So if this model were true, what would we expect to see here? Have a think about that. See, what we'd expect to see would be if iron, oh, this is coal and oil. Yeah, so if coal is dominating initially, which it was in 1870, then all the technology, all the effort has been put into finding ways to use coal efficiently. Then if oil appears, it's like, oh, you know, we're already, if this C is coal and D is oil, we're already way down here. The oil can't compete, okay, because AD is so low, okay. And to bring AD up, we would need like years, decades of investment. We've put decades of investment into making coal cheap. To make oil equally cheap, we need decades of investment in oil. It doesn't have a chance, okay. We'd be stuck, locked in to using coal. But the data tells us that that's not the case. As soon as the oil appears, the data says it starts taking market share. And as oil gets cheaper, its share goes up. Not instantly, but pretty quickly. Yeah. We're not locked in to some particular technology. In fact, the opposite is the case. We seem to be incredibly adaptable. If you look at the shocks and how long it takes to adapt to them, it's like within 10 or 20 years, we seem to have adapted. Okay. And the same for iron and aluminium. So again, in this case, when the aluminium appears, according to this model, it should be like, well, forget it. You know, we're locked into iron now. We've put so much effort into learning how to use iron. Since the Iron Age started, we've been working on this for 2,000 years, 3,000 years. Go away with your aluminium. We don't know what to do with it. That is nonsense. What do we see? We say, wow, this stuff's great. It's light. It's got these different properties, slightly different from iron. We can use this in these applications. It's going to be better. We just need to put a bit of investment in, and in no time, we'll be using it. Okay. So this model, the DTC model, is getting it completely wrong. What went wrong it's again the same as what went wrong with the DTC model to explain the constant factor shares of labor and resources. What went wrong is that this production functions for knowledge are wrong. Okay, basically new knowledge, the production functions for knowledge are wrong. I'm going to pause the video, clean up a bit, and then just explain that a bit because it's quite important. Okay, so what's wrong? So this is the production function for knowledge for one of the inputs. And instead of dividing and then equals, I brought this over. So the period t knowledge is equal to the t minus 1 knowledge times this factor that comes from the investment. Okay. This seems pretty innocuous, but then if you think, imagine we don't know, like when the aluminium just appears, what would this knowledge be? Well, it should be 0, shouldn't it? We don't even know what this stuff is. If this is 0, we can never get off the ground, can we? Because this is always, as long as this is 0, however much we invest, this is 0. So that means ACT is also 0, which means ACT plus 1 must be 0. That's nonsense, isn't it? So what's the problem? The problem is that if aluminium appears, how do we build knowledge on how to use aluminium? We look not just about what we already know about aluminium, we look at what we know about all sorts of other things, iron, but also all sorts of knowledge from the whole economy. So we should instead have some model where ACT is a function of, sure, the specific knowledge we have in the area, but also general knowledge, or a function of all the other knowledge stocks times investment divided, or maybe with some productivity factor. Okay, and if this is very small, then we're going to be building mainly on this, right? So if you're in the catch-up phase where you don't know much, you build on this. This is huge here. There's a huge amount of knowledge here. And the longer you wait, the bigger this gets, the quicker your catch-up will get. It's like China and the US in terms of GDP. Yeah. If China is way, way behind in 1970 and then suddenly decides, right, we're going to go for this, we're going to start trading with the rest of the world, we're going to have a capitalistic system, they can catch up incredibly fast, right? Because even though they have very little own knowledge about technology and so on, they can look at knowledge in the US or in the rest of the world. In the same way, when we start thinking about wanting to use aluminium, we don't know anything about aluminium, but we know loads of other stuff which we can use to work out how to use aluminium. And that basically ties the knowledge stocks together and explains what we see in the data. Okay. So why is this important? Yeah, I really should talk about that a little bit. What am I doing for time? I don't know how long this video has been going on for, but I really should talk about why this is important. So there's a paper from 2012 in the American Economic Review, which is like the most prestigious journal, or it was then anyway, which basically said, had the naive model of technological change and said, we need solar to replace, or we need renewables like solar to replace fossil. But the situation at the moment is like this, that we're heading to the fossil corner. But look, all we need to do is, like in the picture you can see in the corner there, we need to stop this ball rolling and push it over the other way. All we need to do is subsidize researchers to put research into clean knowledge, AC, and stop doing research into fossil knowledge, AD, and then it can be problem solved. We have a burst of research into clean technologies. The level of clean knowledge will go up massively through this big burst of research, or it'll go up enough anyway to get the ball to the top of the hill or past the top of the hill, at which point we can relax, because it'll then, everyone will switch to clean technologies. They'll get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Oh no, my Outlook is playing up. The clean technologies will get cheaper and cheaper. Oh God. Sorry, I might have to close Outlook. Sorry, I'll pause this. Okay, I don't know if you saw all these notifications and stuff coming up, but they were putting me off big time. So I totally forgot where I was. But basically, according to this model from 2012, Asimov's model, all we need to do is persuade researchers through subsidies to move from dirty research to clean research, so to speak, and then everything will be fine. We don't even need a carbon tax. Okay, it's absolute nonsense, and the problem is that it's overstating the role of research, basically. And understating the role of the intrinsic advantages and disadvantages of different technologies. Sure, we can get better at using aluminium through research compared to iron, but aluminium will always be better for making planes out of than iron will be. It doesn't matter how much research we do into making planes out of iron, it will always be worse than making them out of aluminium. Okay. And in a similar way, oil, as long as there is oil under the Saudi Arabian sand, it will always be an incredibly cheap way to power cars and planes. Okay. Because you just stick the pipe in the ground, up it comes, and you've got this dense, transportable source of energy. You know, we need to shift firms and consumers across to clean sources of energy. We need the price on carbon. Okay. Okay. I think that's what I wanted to say on this. We can talk more about it, maybe. Yeah, I'll think about some study questions for this. Let's leave that there for now. Okay, let's work out how to stop this, sorry.